All right, so I think, Mbali, you're supposed to be the keynote speaker and to give some keynotes. So we'll start with your reflections and then we'll go to a more general Q&A with you guys and we'll have a nice discussion. So let's give over to you. I think you don't need any introduction. You have led in politics from the political side, where you're a member of the Democratic Alliance, one of their youngest leaders. You organized in KwaZulu-Natal quite significantly for them and occupied several positions. And then you flipped and became a civil education and mobilization leader in South Africa in this particular election. So your perspectives are valuable because you can give us insight from behind the political lines, and you have a lot of inside knowledge from that side, but you can also speak now from having spoken to ordinary South Africans, trying to get them to care about the democracy and to participate, and particularly that young demographic which still is underrepresented, even though they are a significant part of the population. So we're not going to do a round of applause or anything like that, but we'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Jamie. Is it okay if I sit?
Yes.
Great. So, and I want to say thanks also for starting there, because I have done a lot of work in the political space and organizing. And when I left public office and being a public representative, one of the things that I was very aware of was that most South Africans, aside from people that are generally interested in politics, actually don't really know how their government works, and don't also know what it is that they need to do to be able to get the levers of power sometimes to work for them. And this is a hugely concerning thing in a democracy like ours, because what it means is that our democracy is actually quite tenuous, because you can't have a very stable democracy when the majority of your citizens don't even know what they should be looking for in leaders. So a big part of the work that I've been trying to do is making sure that citizens, young and old, are fully aware of what it means to be active and to take part in an ongoing way in making sure that our democracy works for us and is stable. And so one of the things that I think about when we speak about the GNU and 100 days in and what do we see going forward is that one of our best traits as South Africans is that we are very resilient as people. We've come through a very difficult past. But we are very resilient, and we continue to work and mobilize and do things and protest and have, you know, this idea that we can still get heard. But it also is the trait that I think is now, particularly when you look at the GNU and what's happening, something that allows political parties and political players to take advantage of citizenry, because they just know that we're going to continue to take things and hope for a little bit more to get better at a very slow rate. And this is why we had one dominant party for as long as we did in this particular country. And so there's almost this endless optimism that we have as South Africans, whether it's the Rainbow Nation or Ramaphoria or now GNU-phoria. There's this endless optimism that we think things are going to get better, but my contention about this is that we don't do anything to actually make sure that it happens outside of really just voting every now and then. And I think that this is what we need to change, because unless we're going to have a more measured approach and analysis of our political discourse and what it is that we can do without having to wait for political parties and political players, I don't think that they are ever going to need to do much more than what they feel like doing at that particular time. And I say this as somebody who came from politics, and I can tell you that the majority of the time there is spent on understanding how to find the voter that will vote for you and discard the voters that won't vote for you, because it doesn't matter. And so in this country, the only reason that political parties have done as well as they have outside of the ANC is basically because of differential turnout. They are excellent at being able to pinpoint who it is that they need to vote for them, make sure that those people get to the voting booths, and discourage the people that are not going to vote for them to stay at home or go to the beach or whatever it is on the particular day. And as a result of that, and this is why we also don't see a lot of differences in terms of the numbers for the political parties that have come out in the last 10 years, is that they are very comfortable with who they consider their base. And so there's a number of things that we have to do. One, particularly us as young people, have to flood that voters' roll to be able to skew it in our favor, given the fact that there's 70% of young people in this country who are of eligible voting age but aren't actually registering. But what this means is that we then end up having a situation where older people and people that are already part of a political base of any of the established parties have an outsized influence on deciding what happens in this particular country. And unless we're going to organize and make sure that we are able to have a way that we can then take that power back, nothing is going to change. And there's no reason for political parties to change because they're quite comfortable with the way that things have been happening and have been done. And I would posit that now, particularly with the GNU, it's not going to get better. I think it's going to get worse because now there's an inflated sense of, firstly, that political parties have done better than they have, but secondly, that suddenly things are great. People say that the rand is getting better because, of course, people think about political sentiment as being a real economic driving force, and perhaps a little bit it is, but in truth, the majority of people in this country who are particularly poor, I don't think believe that the GNU has made any difference in their particular lives. Because when we speak about the GNU, what actually has changed? So we have more political parties that are supposedly in government and have become ministers and MECs. But if you look at the statements of intent that was put out on the 14th of June, it had enough vagueness that it was just about saying, we will make the economy better, we will do all of these things with no real effort of how any of that was going to be achieved, particularly considering the political parties that are in the GNU and how diametrically opposed they are on very crucial, big policy decisions where they don't agree with each other. And we've already seen it with the Bella Bill, and even I think this week just with the foreign policy. Mm-hmm. And my worry as South Africa is that we think just because a few more parties are working together that things are going to be better and that it necessarily means that there'll be competition, when we have no evidence of that, because we have no way to hold them accountable. So they can be the GNU for the next 5 years, unless we have mechanisms in place where we can either hold them accountable, recall them, or make sure that between now and the next election, we can raise the flag if we are concerned about certain things. It's still the same as what we had before with just different faces. I also think that without clarity on how the statement of intent is going to be implemented, we still aren't going to get real answers to the big questions. The economy. We have something called the UBI now, or the, what's the popular term for it? The
basic
the basic income grant. I think they're calling it something else. Yeah, anyway, you know. Now, there's a proposal which I think actually could have a real turnaround in terms of the 15, 18 million people that actually apply every single month for a 350 Rand grant, of which only 9 million of them get it. What happens to those other 8 million people who are particularly young people who are going to have the majority of their lives in terms of the economic time when they should be most productive, unable to do anything in this particular country? But that is not something that we have heard anyone in the GNU speak about. We still have the question of the economy, which is huge and all-encompassing. The GNU isn't speaking about that. Political parties aren't even speaking about that, primarily because 76% of them that are in parliament are now part of the GNU. And the only real opposition we have are a new party who I think will take at least 5 years to even understand how their committees work, how to do things. We are seeing them in parliament. They don't know how to stand on the right notions. They haven't put any motions. Their attendance is shoddy. So what we actually have in this country is a GNU that has basically just become a really huge party of people that are very happy that they now have the perks that some of them were out of. And I think the ANC is obviously seething and pissed. But psychologically, I think it's been important for the country to see that we could break the hegemony and the idea that we would always have one particularly big political party. And that's great, because we've also done something, and I mean, we mustn't also be hard on ourselves in South Africa, that is great. We had an entirely peaceful election. We went, all 16 million of us, we voted, we got our voices heard, and thank God, because people didn't think that this was maybe going to happen before the election, the ANC was mature enough to accept the results and then to peacefully continue in their deliberations. And that is not something typically 30 years into a democracy that always happens in Africa. So in that sense, we have a democracy that I think a lot of us want to see work. But I'm going to say again that if we as citizens are unable and don't know what it is that it takes to make a democracy work, how to hold political parties and political leaders to account, how we can get involved outside of having to organize in a political party structure, then we are always going to be beholden to the political parties and quite frankly to, in some cases, very much the lowest, parts of the barrel of the people that they have, because we also don't have a way to influence how political parties choose their leaders. And so we had this amazing Constitutional Court judgment that came down in 2020, giving our parliament 2 years to be able to amend the electoral process. And of course, the political parties that were in parliament at the time made it almost impossible for any new entrants to be able to get in, whether it was signatures or the cumbersome parameters that they put on independence. And they definitely, I think, maliciously complied with what the Constitutional Court had said and used every single tool that they could to make it difficult for us to have a far more representative electoral process. And as a result, we had 1 million people almost being confused and turned away because Section 24A came into the notion. 1 million people in this country, 300,000 spoiled ballots, all because they took so long that they basically forced the IEC to then have to work overtime to be able to comply with all the things that they needed. And we didn't do anything as citizens. Nobody, I mean, aside from civil society organizations that are particularly concerned about parliamentary matters, but en masse, we didn't say anything as citizens about the one thing that actually can make a real difference to how we can have representatives being far more accountable to us. Right now, we have the electoral reform panel that is currently happening with submissions closing on the 30th of October. Here is what we have been asking for the last 30 years, a way for us to make submissions to say, we would like to know who our constituency MP, we'd like it to be more inclusive, or we want first past the post, or we want political parties to tell us who is on their list before we actually go and vote. There's so much that we can actually say now, and I worry that because we don't have a citizenry and because we don't have mechanisms that are built into whether it's our civics or our schooling life that inculcates a behavior of us understanding what's actually happening, we're not going to be able to change the system. And so we'll continue to talk, we'll continue to dialogue, we'll continue to have 150,000 organizations that are on the DSD sites as CSOs that basically keep the fabric of our society from falling apart because they do the service delivery work that sometimes our government doesn't. But we won't be able to organize in a way that actually takes away the power and gives it back to us. So I think that we have a lot of work to do around making sure that the GNU, despite whoever might be part of it, it actually doesn't really matter, because until we have a way that we can decide what we want political parties to do and how we want it to be reflective of society, whoever's in power, whether it's one party or 2 or 15 or 17, we won't be able to make any real headways. And so my concern is that we can go forward, we can talk about how political sentiment seems nice that we have more political parties, but in actuality, there's no real difference that we've seen in these 100 days, and I don't foresee that we're going to see anything different going forward. The only sector that I think might be slightly happy and have more influence is probably business and corporates. And I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with that, but again, it becomes a situation where as citizens, particularly as poor people, disadvantaged communities, it makes government and it makes the idea of delivery to them even further than what it currently is now. And so I think it's incumbent on those of us in particular who have the means, whether social capital, financial capital, resources, to actually consider how we're going to have a compact about what we're going to do, and not just fucking dialogue, guys. And I think particularly young people in this country, we don't have a platform where we are able to en masse really talk to each other. The older generation had the umbrella of the ANC and apartheid, and this is why you see so many of them, and you can basically link it, whether it's business or politics, of how people know each other. Where do we meet? Where do we organize? Where do we have this broader mission of what we're actually doing? And are we prepared to also understand that part of that is going to be, whether you call it class suicide or whatever it is, a real discomfort in how we consider ourselves to be comfortable to make sure that everybody has the ability to rise up in the society. And I will leave it there, Jamie, but my provocation is that I don't think we can organize enough, and if we don't, it doesn't matter what happens with the GNU 100 days before or 100 days forward, because we won't have any say anyway.
That's a very tough, robust opening. So I'm going to introduce the panel so that the viewers who are going to watch this on YouTube or are in the room and maybe don't know the panel get to know you guys, right? So I'm going to read the short bios, which have some English words that may be beyond my reading grade, but I'll try. Right, so we've got Dr. Tabang. Please raise your hand so that they see you. I think Dr. Tabang is going to be the easiest. Right, Dr. Tabang Sefalafala is a sociology lecturer at Wits University. His research areas are labor, industrial policy, and development, with a focus on unemployment and precarity. See, I told you some English words that are going to precarity. You're going to Google that one later. He previously served as a deputy director in Gauteng's Department of Economic Development and holds a PhD in sociology. Then we've got Pindile Kunene. Please raise your hand, Pindile, so that they see you. Right? Pindile is a learning and development specialist with over a decade of experience in social justice. And here's another word I'm not going to know. Rooted in Freudian. Is it Freudian? How do you say that? Papale. Freudian. There you go. There you go. Rooted in Freudian and feminist traditions. She designs educational programs fostering leadership, critical thinking, and creativity. She's a thought leader, activist, and accomplished public speaker. And now she's mic'd up, so we're good to go with the mic there. Then we've got Yologazi. Please also raise your hand. Yologazi Mfuto is a development practitioner and political analyst focused on socio-economic, political, and health issues affecting the youth. She holds degrees in communication, political science, and international relations, and she is pursuing a master's in human rights at the University of Pretoria. So we've got a nice spread. I've already introduced Mbali, who we will still hear from later. They're saying I must sit down, do la fasi and stuff. Right, let me do that. Right, so my first question is really going to be twofold. And you can answer one of the two, depending on whichever one you think is most instructive. Mm-hmm. Number one is, does the 100-day metric in and of itself matter, right, in terms of assessing this particular administrative period? Is it too early? Is it too late? Number two is, what are your reflections on this particular 100-day period? And I'm going to drill down later. People say, I always keep it real, and I tell it like it is. So if I feel like we're getting too diplomatic, I'm going to poke holes in our diplomacy. But if I feel like we're also getting too aggressive on the GNU, I'm going to pull us back, right, for balance. But that's where I want to start it. So maybe we'll start with you, and you'll tell us one of those two. Either does it matter or it doesn't matter, or also, what are your reflections so far on where this whole project is at?
Thank you so much, Jimmy. Good morning, everyone. I was going to complain about the aircon, but who has the power in this one? Because you can tell by the aircon, but who's got the power?
It's often indicative.
Well, firstly, to answer your question, Jimmy, yes, 100 days matter, particularly for the parties that are included in the GNU, because now they've gotten what they wanted. It's time to measure. Are they happy? What they've done? And if you are working as a young person, or generally as a person, when you get a work of place, 3 months is probation. You are checked if you are accustomed to the place, and you are checking yourself as well, transport-wise, are you getting along with your colleagues, and so on and so forth. So the 100 days did matter. I did understand when the opposition party was hosting a party. I was like, yes, because they've gotten what they wanted, they've measured, it makes sense. But for me, it didn't make much sense for the organization that is the champion in the GNU, the ANC, to celebrate that, because pretty much they've lost elections. So it could have been a moment of a caucus or a debrief moment in a closed space for them to actually verify or overview what's happening, where we at, are we working well with these people, right? So on twofold, it was good for the DA to actually reflect and have a hoo-ha about it, because they've gotten to be part of government, and the other parties as well. But secondly, the GNU, it looks like it's people who just got married, right? Which way we were good for each other, and then they just got married without actually having a sit down or pre-counseling for marriage, or having to discuss what are your values, what are your principles, what are you looking for in this relationship, and so on and so forth. They never had that. Hence now we're having this public spat of the DA calling about the president can't speak on foreign policy without consulting us. The ANC in Gauteng having to say we can't work with the DA, we want, because we don't reach a consensus. So such things, and also the discussion about what is sufficient consensus according to the DA, according to the ANC. So they never had a moment where they could actually iron out what is it that they want in this government. And the other thing that is a deadlock now that is actually hindering progress is the fact that they don't have a policy standing where their agreement to say this is what you're working towards. They are working towards existing policies, which are from the ANC pretty much, right? Because they don't have that paper that they say they're going to do after 3 weeks, right? They have not said. And I was listening to the news the other day, the minister in monitoring at the presidency was saying that could be concluded next year. So meaning that from now on until that paper is done, that policy standpoint is done, they are going to work towards the ANC's policies, right? Is it fair for the other parties that are within the GNU, right? So it's something that they can actually have a conversation about. But generally, I do think that the GNU is a point where we can actually appreciate the maturity of our democracy. And secondly, it has been a good win for parties like Rising Zanzi, for instance, that they had an entry into government. It's good for us to actually be on the side and say, government is doing this and this and you don't like it. But it's also better when we get to form part of government so that we can actually implement the changes that we've been wanting, right? So the GNU has done so well. I think it's a great opportunity for the small parties that we regard as small parties. They can make a significant change. And the bigger parties, it's time for them to reflect and maybe take a back seat and actually allow other parties to actually advise them on what can be done right, particularly the leading party, which is the ANC. They could learn a lot from the other parties and also allow them to take up a leading role in the different departments that they are leading as ministers and in some provinces, so that they can actually effect the change that they've been wanting, and also their manifestos should be reflected in government policies.
All right. That's I think clear. Where do you stand on it, Kinle?
So I spent my 20s, the latter part of my 20s, working with politicians in the political offices I served 3 MECs in Gauteng. And through that, I learned very quickly that politicians actually take this 100 days seriously. And this was still under ANC, but as a spokesperson, as a communicator, you had to have a plan. 100 days to show the world what I've done. 100 days in office. So this 100 days is a big deal, and it's been a big deal for politicians like showcasing, and I think even more so now, because as Yologazi said, we have new parties that have been given new responsibilities under this arrangement, they want to showcase what they've been capable of. Yeah, what they're capable of, what they've been up to. But also, I mean, as a citizen, I have enjoyed tremendously just watching the 100 days. I've enjoyed watching the tussles and the disagreements between the parties on substantive issues, on policy issues. I've enjoyed watching a government that is just not an ANC government, that is now a government made up of, is it 10 parties. I've enjoyed watching the PAC shift and the way the PAC positions itself. So I think the 100 days has been important. I think it's been a good period. I think also it's been an educational period, because I think there are people who perhaps were not so interested in politics because it was the same faces, the same parties, the same debates, and now things are shifting and they sort of tuning in into what's happening. In terms of the 100 days as a metric for measuring progress and what's been done, I think maybe too soon, but I think the 100 days has been enough to show us where the major disagreements are, with, like I said, the tussles are, as well as to see, I mean, if you paid attention to the manifestos of the different political parties and saw the GNU unfold, you obviously have big questions about how the two big parties in this arrangement would sort of find each other, given that the manifestos speak to totally different things. So I'm interested in watching that unfold and learning from what's unfolding.
All right. Dr. Taban, what about you? Where do you stand on the question of the 100 days and the second question?
Thank you, Jamie. I think it's significant. I think the 100-day matrix is significant, particularly for me. It's a season to gauge what the post-election mood is like, right? And I think one of the things that we can really celebrate as a country, we've got so many problems, but I think one of the things that we can really be proud of is that we do have a participatory democracy. Right? It can be a bourgeois democracy or whatever criticism, but the fact that after 100 days, things have panned out the way they have, I think it's something that we need to take note of as a young democracy of only 30 years. Right? In terms of the various indicators that we market indicators, employment, investments, and so on, I think it's a little bit too early, but at the same time, we're hearing a lot of positive sentiments, particularly from the markets, that the business confidence is up in the country, which is not necessarily a bad thing. And also, I mean, it signifies the fact that something is shifting in the country, right? So obviously, I think that the GNU will change a few things. Maybe it will be accompanied. Maybe it will not necessarily be the one that produces changes, but it will be accompanied by, economic growth and some market outcomes that we have not had as a country in a while. But the challenge remains ensuring that the marginalized are not left behind. Right? The biggest controversy of South Africa's democracy is that we are a nation of too many unemployed people. 12 million adults cannot find a job and they live in distress. Right? So yes, it's too early, but I think that it's going to be incumbent upon other forces in society on what do we do about this moment. Right, so I don't expect massive policy shifts, and in actual fact, I don't think that there's massive policy differences between the ANC and the DA. Let me explain. So the ideology that underpins the two parties' policies is not that different. Both of them embrace a market-based kind of economic ideology, right? Of course, there are areas of disagreement, and I think those areas are evident. But I think that since 1994, the ANC has been very clear on pursuing a market-based approach, which involves privatization of state-owned enterprises. And this approach is now being intensified through the Operation Vulindlela, through the economic reforms. I mean, we're hearing this term, economic reforms, every single day. And basically what it means is that there's a concerted effort to improve the competitiveness and efficiency of the economy. And the IMF and the World Bank are very happy about that. As you've seen, they've kind of increased our growth prospects because they feel that the kind of economic reforms that they agree with are now taking place in South Africa. So the coalition between the ANC and the DA, for me, fundamentally at the economic ideological level, it makes sense, right? The areas of difference, we've had a few spats about the BEE, the NHI, the nationalization of the Reserve Bank, and the land question, right? But if you look at all of those, they are not things that you can achieve immediately. To take back the land, you need to amend the constitution. To nationalize the Reserve Bank, you need to amend the legislation again. And to implement the NHI, you need a costing model. It still needs to be figured out how it can be achieved. So I feel like the GNU can actually kick those things down, down the road, and continue consolidating areas of policy agreement.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much for those opening answers. I'm going to ask now a more, I think, human resources question about the ministers, because I think one of the things that Mbali mentioned was the challenge about evaluating the performance of leaders, that kind of thing. So what we've seen in the last 100 days, we've seen one minister who has hired people from YouTube, right, controversially so, one who was asked to leave. We don't know whether they left or not. And I'm talking here about the Minister of Agriculture, John Steenhuisen. And then we've also seen the Minister of Justice, Thembisi Melane, being implicated in the VBS issue, and then saying that she doesn't have to step aside or even, take a leave of absence, even though her portfolio directly oversees the NPA, where the NPA has that obligation to investigate her. Then we've seen the Minister of Sports, Arts and Culture spending 450,000 rands in 7 days on chauffeur services in France at the World Cup. And now he's booking his own private transport with Hertz, et cetera, But when I take that in conjunction with the questions which have been asked about staffing, where it's been revealed that several ministers have not even staffed their private offices. And those private offices, some of them are costing 10 million a year, some of 15 million, for instance, for the Department of International Relations. It makes me wonder, how do you evaluate the individual performance of these ministers, these gaps in vacancies, these faux pas in the hiring, if you will, or even some of these indiscretions or mistakes that are already showing up 100 days? Because most of these things did happen in this honeymoon 100-day period. And of course, there are 3 or 4 ministers that have been pointed out, but I think if we did a forensic analysis, we would find that a lot of ministers have not even staffed their offices, which is worrying, because you would expect that with the urgency of the problems, these issues would be dealt with. So if we're talking about performance of government officials, performance of the executive, what is your assessment having looked at these types of things?
Well, Jamie, the staffing part is quite complicated and quite complex. I have 2 views about it. But let me start with the 2 cases that we've seen. One, someone said when the GNU was established that in the next 2 months, we are going to have scandals. The ANC will have a scandal, the DA will have a scandal. But now they won't necessarily attack each other like they did before. Let's see how it unfolds. And truth of the matter, it did. The ANC had the Minister of Justice actually being implicated in the VBS issue. The DA was surprisingly quiet. And then the DA had the issue with that colleague who was racist. The ANC also did not take much into consideration to that. So we do see that, okay, now they are trying to please each other in the GNU, trying to make this honeymoon works, right? But maybe now to answer your question on the staffing, and maybe the irregularities that happens there. Most of the times, there's some ministers, they tend to forget the role of the ministerial position and the department itself. So they tend to overlap and try to bring their own people to do the department's work, right? And some of the times, then continuity, the work done in the previous years, gets lost in the pipeline because they want to bring their own new people, right? And there's nothing wrong bringing your own people who are assisting you in your campaigning, but you can't bring them for strategic positions that necessarily needs institutional memory, that needs continuity, that needs strategy. You can bring your people to prepare you to travel, and if they have the skills, bring them. But to actually do the work of the department itself, or even the ministry itself, it's important that you get people who are skilled, people who also has experience, because sometimes you can get the education, it's important, but also experience has a role, I mean, particularly in a high position. So our ministers have lacked in that, and two, they tend to politicize everything. There's, I know in one department, the minister actually fired everyone from the previous ministry, right? And I'm like, how is it, why don't you have a conversation with the previous minister and say that who's good at what? I can keep a certain number of people. I can try by all means to actually ensure that also I get to shine, and you don't shine as an individual, you shine with the people that you have in your back, right? So it's important that they actually keep the people, not only on a moral perspective. For human resources, it's important for continuity, but also morally. How do you just say, all of you leave, I'm going to bring my new people? It doesn't sit well for people who say that we represent the masses. We have constituencies as well. So it's important that they look into that. But also as a country, it's important that we are able to hold these ministers to account. Yes, the mechanism in doing it professionally, they are not necessarily in our faces. As people who are here, maybe we can be able to hold certain ministers right to their offices, complain here and there. But for other people, it's not possible. So it's important that us who are able to do that, we're able to call them out and say, you don't do things like this. If it needs be, write a tweet and say, it's important that you keep the person who was writing speeches or was writing documents for this, right? It's important because they are good in what they do.
But let's not make it too abstract. We have all of these ministers more than before. We are seeing, for example, in agriculture, that there's no staff in the minister's office. What does that mean for agriculture? If the minister, who, as you say, he's been waiting to be in this government position, he's been waiting to be a minister. One of the things that Mandela spoke about in Long Walk to Freedom was how they became a government in waiting and knew who they are going to employ. Keir Starmer has already staffed all of his positions, right? We've seen all of the ministers in the UK government in new cabinet positions staffing very fast because they obviously know who they want to bring in. What does it mean when we say agriculture is the backbone, one of the big backbones of the economy, the minister comes in and the office is not staffed? What does that tell us from that 100-day lens, where if we were now bringing the minister to say 100-day review, just like anybody who goes for that 90-day review, what are we extracting from that?
Yeah, definitely. Were there no staff before the minister came in? So it's quite interesting that you chase people to go and then don't have people to come in. Probably they're still scrambling for who to put where, and they're fighting within the party itself. We don't know, right? But it's quite immature for the minister to actually not employ people and not have staff because they are still fixing their own internal squabbles. And meanwhile, they had people who actually were skilled enough, because we never had the Minister of Agriculture. We did have our issues with the land and some issues here and there, and maybe where funds are dispersed. But in terms of the actual work done by the ministry, we didn't have much cream. So why is the minister not having anyone even from the previous administration? So it's quite telling on the maturity of the leader or the political figure that is occupying that space. And it's quite unfortunate that our politicians subject people to such.
So can I just come in?
Yeah, no, you should come in. Come in.
I think two things for me. So I'm not going to focus on the political or the private office, but
Yeah.
I'll tell you that there are two things that we've sort of learned from this election. The first one, I think Mbali already hinted at, that there was a lot of pessimism, and there was a lot of people were actually saying that we're asking the question, will the ANC accept the results and actually behave in a mature way and put systems in place to actually, make way for a new government, should it not? People were talking about how we're going to ZANU PF, and one might also even argue that Frelimo. So the ANC sister parties in many instances do not accept the results if those results are not favorable. Maputo is in crisis now. We've seen what's happening in Mozambique. We've seen what happened in Zimbabwe over time. We know what's happening with Chama Mpinduzi in Tanzania. So there was that negative sentiment, but the ANC accepted the results, and in 14 days we had some form of a government. So, and I don't think maybe it says something about the ANC as a democratic force, but I think it also says something about the resilience of our democracy,
can I
right?
push back on this
let me complete. The second thing that I wanted to say is that what we know from this election is that we also have a resilient public service. The leadership of the country changed insofar as the political party at the helm of governance changed completely. And yet the public servants carried on to do their work. So most of the things that actually we've been saying about public servants and the party and loyalty to the party and all of that, we haven't seen worrying signs in the 100 days of public servants actually sabotaging the new government.
Except
what we've seen actually
in Pretoria,
is public
when the
servants.
lights went off the next day, the power station blew up.
Well, but we don't know, right?
Just saying,
we
did
don't
see
know. But
and
what I
know.
can tell you is that directors generals are on the job doing their work.
Yes.
Chief directors are doing their work. Directors, we've seen handover processes happening, and we've seen actually public servants behaving quite maturely. We've seen the National School of Government preparing itself for this particular moment and leaning on the Constitution.
I want to push
so
back a
very
bit.
often we are very pessimistic about who we are as a people and our institutions, and that's not healthy. And the reason why I thought I should highlight those two is because I very quickly also want us to move perhaps from analyzing the different ministers and what happens in the political offices. I don't want to say a lot of things about that because as I said, I did occupy that space. And I also know that some of the mistakes that are being made now may seem shocking, but I've also seen things
You've seen them.
in the past. And so I don't want to dwell much on it, but
Yes.
I do want to, if you will give me an opportunity, to sort of go back to Tabang's comments. And
But
to
wait,
link,
let me push
link
back
with,
first before you think. Because you and Mbali have said something which I don't know if I've fully believed from the first time it's been said. I've thought it was a talking point of the GNU and the ANC. This idea that this is the moment of transition where we were going to see threats of violence or anything to that effect. Because with a 40% number and a willing coalition partner that had already indicated well in advance with market support that, hey, we're going to raise our hand, we're going to do a deal with you. I don't think that this particular election was the moment where that threat became real. I've heard people say that, well, there was this risk that the ANC, it was, I mean, at 40% you could be pushed out. But if obviously there are two alternative parties that people don't want to work with, then it becomes a little bit more obvious that this is the direction. Do you not think that 2029 is the real test of whether the ANC will hand over power? Because at 40%, you can still make a deal, right? You still have first mover advantage, basically. And we've seen many governments around the world which can form coalitions with 40 and govern. I mean, if you think about countries like Israel, etc. Netanyahu has governed for a very long time with about a 35 to 40% number. So I just wonder are we being 100% genuine when we say this was that moment where the ANC was facing a moment of truth of, do we accept losing or what? Because they lost the election, but they didn't really. So that's the pushback. Before you go to...
Yeah, sure, I get that, but this is a national liberation movement, a former national liberation movement that's been in power for 30 years and presided over the state for 30 years. And if you look at Zim and how ZANU behaved at those particular moments, I mean, the ANC's approach to it was completely different.
Yes,
and I do think that there was maybe some basis for people to be cautious because of the close relations with ZANU. That, I mean, the ANC doesn't have a very critical perspective on ZANU-PF.
And Frelimo.
And Frelimo, right? And these are sister parties, and Chama Mapinduzi, CCM in Tanzania, these are sister parties that come from almost the same political moment, fighting colonialism, apartheid in different countries, relations formed over the years. But if you look at the behavior of those, Frelimo doesn't lose elections.
Yeah.
I mean, this particular elections, there are big questions. Young people said, we don't want this thing, this Frelimo. But Frelimo doesn't lose elections. Frelimo insiders, my comrades, friends, and all of that, were saying in this particular elections, we need to accept losing the election so that we can make processes towards the renewal of the party and all of that. But the problem is that Frelimo doesn't allow that loss
No,
to
I
occur.
agree with your
So I
analysis
do
in
think
that
that there was
respect,
some exaggeration about the dangers that we faced. I do think that 40% is quite significant. And if you studied and looked at the ANC, those comrades were hemorrhaging. They were bruised and battered from this particular elections because they lost massively, and I do think that, I don't think we should praise a fish for swimming, but I do think that South Africans have a tendency of being too pessimistic about certain things, and also this question of a foregone conclusion. This election is a foregone conclusion. ANC is not going to accept the loss, and they're going to unleash violence. And the circles that I moved in, some of the workshops that I convened, this question was coming up all the time. And my response, of course, was that, well, I mean, the ANC has been losing power. The ANC lost the economic centers. We didn't see that. So on what is the base, on what are you basing this particular? So that's what I wanted to
Okay, and then you wanted
highlight.
to piggyback off what Dr. Tabang said.
Yes, I do, and maybe to think through how the GNU has sort of been interpreted, right? Tabang and I were talking before we started, and we were saying that, he was saying that he came across about 200 articles, right, Tabang, just on business day, on the 100 days. And I read the Sunday Times, and there's just a lot, and I know it's a nightmare for most people too, because it's like an overload. And my job as an educator, as a learning practitioner, is to go through all of that and then to try and find, okay, what are the 3 or 4 main positions about this GNU. And so my understanding now from going through the literature and what's in the media and all of that, from let's say from a left perspective, a progressive perspective, there's like 3 positions on this GNU. There are people who feel and who felt immediately when the deal was signed, so to speak, that this is a sellout, a complete sellout, and that this is not a GNU, it's actually a government of neoliberal unity, that these neoliberal forces have found each other, and that this will actually spell disaster for our country, if you look at the unemployment situation, the poverty levels, and so on and so forth, and that basically this GNU will continue to reproduce the colonial and apartheid fault lines. A lot of people in the EFF, in the MK, fall within that camp. My friend Duma Kukule also is very much on.
SACP as well.
And the SACP is also on that solely every time is, okay? So these 3, I'm going to give you 3 interpretations. They're interesting because they give us an analysis of where we are, but they also sort of hint at how do we get out, right? So for the people in interpretation 1, this government of national unity, it's very much about break this coalition. The ANC could have found other coalition partners. EFF is there, MK is there. The big question that I have, particularly about the MK, is that this is an anti-democratic force. If you look at its policy positions, I mean, they said on the 100 days of the GNU that they would have, had they been in power, they would have done away with the constitution in favor of parliamentary sovereignty. Some of the things that they stand for, they want to take us very far. Actually, they want to take us to Swaziland. What our comrades in Swaziland are fighting against, that's where they want us. They want to take us to. So that's the first thing. The second thing then is that, and of course some might say, I mean, the EFF is ambivalent about the Constitution. It's useful when they think it is, and then at some points they think it's something that should be discarded. So there's this back and forth on that. The second interpretation is one that says this GNU is an opportunity to recalibrate South Africa and South African society. And this interpretation says, I like it somewhat because it foregrounds class analysis. So this interpretation says that there was no clear winner in this election, And in class terms, they argue that we do have a political and an economic stalemate where business doesn't trust the ANC anymore, and the social base that voted for the DA shows that they don't trust this very corrupt ANC that has presided over instability and crisis in our society. But that business can't march on its own. It still needs this 40%. So this analysis says that this GNU is an effort at bridging overcoming this particular stalemate. And of course, part of the way out that is presented by this interpretation, the stalemate interpretation, is that we do need, beyond the GNU, to talk about this national dialogue. Mustn't just be an elite conversation. We need to have a national dialogue, this idea of social compacting, that we need to find each other as labor, as business, as communities, and so forth. That's the second interpretation. My question for them, and I've been posing this, is that who keeps the fires of economic transformation burning in this particular moment where you're calling on people who have been squeezed, are in a corner, to make more compromises? Is there still room for compromise, given how fractured our society is? The third interpretation is one that says, yes, we recognize that this GNU is an elite pact, so sharing very much what interpretation one says, but goes a little bit further by saying that we need an alternative from below, and actually says that if you look at the confident voice right now, and Tabang already said this, business is quite confident in this moment. They're confident not only in saying this is good, but they're confident in also saying this is what we want, right? When the GNU was announced in July, it was announced in June, in July, early July, business came out with statements, with some demands, 4 demands essentially. We want, what's this thing, a friendly, business-friendly environment. We can unpack what that means. We want public funds, the public purse to be managed better, or public finances to be reined in. We want, what was the third thing? We want more public-private partnerships. And then there was the fourth thing that they said was that we want, the professionalization of the public service, which is great. But business has been quite confident in asserting its demands and what it wants, and Mbali also hinted at that. Now, this interpretation 3 is interesting because it does say there's no more room for compromise. And South Africa is unstable today, and we see these horrid levels of crime and violence in our society, largely because of these economic and social policies that have not dealt with the wound, basically. And to think that you can have stability and you can have business working and being profitable under these conditions is a lie. People ignored this extortion business when it started in the townships in Khayelitsha because it was affecting working class people and nurses and small business and all of that. But in Cape Town now, the trucks that are delivering bread and supplies to the shopping malls and whatnot are under siege. They are now having to pay extortion fees. So the environment is not conducive for making good business, actually. And business in this country has to realize that for them to actually make money and to thrive and to be competitive, they have to go back to the values of the Constitution and what the Constitution promises. And it's no longer possible to continue to extract from the South African economy, from the working people, without having all of these terrible things that are happening, the violence, the crime, and all of that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a powerful contribution. We're going to come over to, not immediately, I'm giving you a heads up, because we have leadership from Rising Zanzi in the room, and MEC, who you may know. I'm going to give her the mic soon, but I wanted to get responses from Tabang. This issue of professionalization, performance, right? This idea within the neoliberal framework that they can have meritocratic execution. From what we've seen with the ministers, in these 100 days, because we only have what we have. Yeah. We have to assess the match, because I feel like, to a degree, you guys don't want to evaluate the match at halftime or at the first quarter if it was a basketball match. But we have seen players on the court. Some of them have had turnovers. Some of them have had fouls. Some of them have had air balls. We've had a plethora of things happen. So looking at it from what we've seen, what are you taking away from that?
Yeah, you know, it's interesting because we're reflecting on something that is not finished. So it's
Yeah.
unfinished
It's
reflection.
half time, it's fine. It's part of commentary. At the half time,
Right.
they stop the match and you talk about it, and it's sponsored by an alcohol brand. So go ahead.
Right. So, for me, the important thing is this, right? So there's a need to make a distinction between capacity and capability, right? So in capacity, I'm talking about the state. So we need capacity in the state, one, to deliver, right? And I'm talking from a developmentalism point of view, right? That if it's the Department of Agriculture or Economic Development or whatever department it is, it doesn't really matter. What really matters is that we need to build a capable state. And that state needs to be capacitated by capable people, right? So having served in public office, I mean, it feels like a lifetime ago now, right?
Yes, yeah. You were in there.
I was in
In
there.
it, the
And one
trenches.
thing that I do know is that I was a professional there. I wasn't in public office.
Yeah.
And as a professional, regardless of who is the MEC or who is the premier or whatever, there is a policy stance that we're pursuing, right? There's a policy directive that we're pursuing as public servants, as professionals, right? So I think for me, if vacancies are, you know, still unfilled, it raises questions as to how are we going to deliver if we don't have capable people in those seats. But interestingly, I mean, I've noticed in a few municipalities, there's so many vacancies, right?
Yeah.
The DTIC has been advertising for DG position, DDGs, Tshwane is also very senior. There are so many vacancies that are also going around. Maybe it's still too early to say why aren't those vacancies being filled. Maybe it's in the process. Right?
But how long is the process? Because the thing that someone said to me in a different forum is that it seems like there's no urgency, and I think Mbali was also alluding to that. Going into this election, the murder rate was very high. The rates of GBV and femicide were very high. The unemployment rate between the ages of 15 to 24 is 70%. On the expanded definition. It's 50% between the ages of 25 to 34. These are not insignificant issues. The issues you're talking about extortion, kids drowning going to schools, the 40% dropout rate, these are long-standing problems, which for me it feels as if I were coming in to be part of an administration which is facing these types of challenges, I wouldn't be lackadaisical or nonchalant about staffing my office so that we can get to work. So what we've seen is a lot of rhetoric, but when it comes to the real corporate administrative issues, it seems as if some ministers are falling behind. And for me, I don't know if we can genuinely accept that 100 days is enough, or even that there should be vacancies for DGs that sit for months on end.
Yeah, it's hard to say, right? It's really hard to say, but for me, it's really the question of what we need to be asking the GNU then is, if we are talking about changing the prospects of South Africa, what kind of state do we need to build? And what kind of people do we need to have in there? There's so many capable young people in this country, right, that are ready, very ready, to step in and make a change in how we run government. It's very hard to tell. It's very hard to say because one department hasn't filled up vacancies, there's no sense of agency. It's very, very hard to say.
Okay, all right, he's being diplomatic.
Yeah.
Personally, I feel as if people are going into the trauma ward as surgeons, but stopping off in the canteen to drink some coffee and have a nice chat while the trauma ward is beeping them as things stand. And I would have expected to see more urgency.
Is that what's really happening?
I mean, what can you tell me if black farmers are saying that they've got issues of funding, we're going into a drought, you haven't even staffed your office, what does that mean for them? Does that then mean that they must just chill whilst you look for people on YouTube or whatever? And it's not about the minister himself. This extends to all of them who haven't staffed, right? It seems to me that there's no urgency in places where there should be urgency. And this is not the best time to bring you in, Vuyiswa, but I do want to bring you in just to reflect, because you are currently sitting as in an MEC position in the Government of Provincial Unity, and we want to hear your reflections as a political practitioner, somebody who's in the belly of the beast, trying to change it from inside, about your reflections. So I'm going to hand over my mic, and then you're just going to speak into it.
Nice.
Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you very much, Jamie. And I am also really grateful to the panelists for your insights. Let me start by saying podcasters' lives matter. And justice for YouTubers, Jamie. You know, they are people too. But on a more serious note, I think there's some really important reflections that have come through from the comments. And I probably will, let me reflect a bit on the national picture and then perhaps give some insight into the provincial picture, which is different from the national picture by virtue of the way provincial government is made up and the balance at provincial government. So I think the GNU, on balance, was the best case scenario and best outcome for us. We should not make the mistake of imagining that it is a permanent arrangement. By no means is it a permanent arrangement. It is a transitionary agreement. It is, let me say, making lemonade out of lemons. The cold, hard reality is that every party that fights an election fights to win. Everybody would want to walk away with 51% and a mandate to govern without having to consult others. But that just did not happen. So there is a forced marriage. Some are navigating the forced marriage better than others. And I think we must see it for what it is. So that's number one. And obviously, then coming to your question about 100 days and what's realistic and possible in 100 days, you know, I often say that we get the politics we deserve. If you've ever done anything, like I'm saying as a citizen, if you've ever tried to get a document processed in government or by a government department, if you've tried to rezone your house, for example, or you've applied for a marriage certificate or whatever, you'd be lucky if you can get that in 100 days. So the demand that we as citizens place on politicians to show us something shiny in 100 days results in an outcome where people are then giving you what you want. And what I mean by that is we all know intellectually that the problems that we have in our country are structural.
Yeah.
You are not fixing spatial injustice at a macro scale in 100 days. We all know that we have different spheres of government that are interrelated, although independent, but interrelated. So a simple thing like wanting to resolve a housing challenge requires a policy to exist, a province to allocate budget to a housing project, a municipality that's hopefully functional to actually issue land, development rights and all of that type of stuff. So we know these things intellectually, and yet we still want to see shiny things in 100 days. And I'm saying, I've been very clear on a personal level. I've been very clear that, and I said this even when I was campaigning, not much can happen in 100 days. So how have I spent my 100 days? I've spent my 100 days absorbing, figuring out where and what the problem is, actually. Because a big part of trying to resolve the problem, I mean, you You find out today that you've got the job and you're expected tomorrow to have a fully fledged strategy about what you're going to do. Every media house is asking you, what are you doing in your first 100 days? Wazelapi. When did you have time to even read the annual report, to analyze the reports coming out of the legislature, to do a proper analysis of what it is that needs to be fixed? And even on the topic of the hiring of staff, and I think it's an important point you make, that the crisis, it is urgent, it's urgent. But what we have also come out of in the past is a situation where political officers get stuffed with all rank and file branch members. Because there's a long list of people who believe they are deserving or entitled to those jobs because they campaigned for you. Now, we also don't want that. So we need to be able to find the balance of, good, well-considered governance and solutioneering, but also fast implementation. And I do think that the opportunity that the GNU gives us, which is, an established concept, even in business, it gives us competition. There is now a healthy spirit of competition that exists, even though people may be co-governing. But we are now in a space where, in those co-governance agreements, an existential question for a lot of parties is going to be, how do I secure myself for the next round? And how do I make sure that I am visible to my constituency and the work that we're doing and the impact we're making is visible? And I think perhaps maybe if I make a generous analysis or assumption, that leads to higher levels of competition. And it also requires of the voters themselves to be more discerning, to ask themselves, hey, I like what that person's saying. Where are they from? Actually, what party said that? And I think there's a lot more of that type of posturing, and you'll see it. The Divisive Alliance is talking about DA ministers. And then you're like, but I thought you're just a minister. But it's like they're trying to own that space, in a really, they're trying to show themselves. Similarly, you have other parties that, and I don't want to comment on others, but I'm just saying, even ourselves, as Rise Mzansi, people are saying, you've got one seat in provincial government. How do you stand out? How do you not just be, as Troy Macy for the ANC? And I'm saying, well, actually, the benefit of where we sit right now is we have a portfolio to showcase our style of governance and what we bring to the table. Our parliamentarians are out there every day putting pressure and making sure that our work is visible. So I think that spirit of competition overall has the potential to kick out favorable outcomes, but it is a two-way street. And the citizens themselves need to see this moment as an opportunity. It's like a buffet now. Before it was like an a la carte menu and you only had 3 choices. Now you've got a lot of different options, and it's up to you to actually now, and Mbali was touching on it, is that how do we then ensure that we're investing in a citizenry that also is more empowered to make better decisions? And I do think that that's the work that also has to happen to strengthen this democratic project.
Yeah, so I have just one follow-up for you, or just like a little pushback and kind of a follow-up. So the one is, in my other life, I'm a coach, right? And it can take a year to see transformations in somebody that you're coaching, right? And I coach communications. So even in that 2 weeks, I can see who's taking it seriously and who's not taking it seriously, So I think there's still something that can be observed even in the 100 days, but that's more of a comment rather than a solicitation for a response, because I think we can agree on that. My question is, these structural changes, everybody's spoken about them to some degree, and there's an appreciation that you do need structural change. I'm worried, though, that we're not going to see much in terms of structural change in this particular GNU period. It doesn't seem like there's enough political will or also political capital to be able to push through some of the structural change without, for instance, agitating the market, which may feel uncomfortable with some of those changes. But when I look at this kind of makeup at a national level, I don't see any real appetite for anything which is a structural change in the way that it addresses some of the long-term problems we've been talking about. I don't know if I'm too harsh. I don't know what your reflections are on that.
No, I think that's a fair reflection, but also perhaps it's important to accept that structural change is not an overnight project, right? So it's incremental by design, and incremental in that one of the benefits for me, the biggest win from this election is that, and you'll know this, when we, as Rise Mzansi campaigned, our campaign message was simple. We said we need new leaders because we diagnosed our problem as a leadership issue. To the point that Sispindile makes is that we have people in the public service, fantastic people actually, qualified people, highly qualified actually. But where the real failure comes is in the setting of the agenda, the leadership, and creating a culture and an environment of performance. That's what the political principle is there to do, right? So I'm saying that aspect is also incremental, because if you look at it, of the 32, there's 32 ministers, 48 deputy ministers, whatever, but those are all departments that are now sitting with a potentially different type of leader who can bring a different type of perspective to the same problems, by the way, the same problems, because, and we spoke a bit about policy issues, right? If you look at the GNU statement of intent, I mean, no one can disagree that those things need to be done. Like, come on.
Yeah.
Inclusive economic growth, like,
Yeah.
tick, food security, tick. That's not where the controversy lies. That's not even where the rubber hits the road. The rubber hits the road in the how you do it. So what does it mean to grow an economy in Gauteng? And one party's theory of change is different from another's. That's actually what differentiates us. It's the point that you were making, that on balance, these parties are largely the same, but it's in the question of the how. So my point is that the structural change happens, one, incrementally, but it's a function of it's a function of those daily decisions. And for me, it's like an onion, You first deal with the leadership issue. Then you deal with the kind of like organizational culture and values issues. Then you get to, the policy framework can remain the same. Then you get to, okay, what are the priorities that we need to address now? And then it gets to the how then is the best to do it. And that will be different depending on who's doing it. And I think that's where we start to see things moving. But again, it's up to the electorate to then be able to say, actually, I quite like that education minister's approach. And the nature of political leadership is it sets the tone. It's not meant to do anything more than set the tone, quite frankly. It's meant to say, this is what is important in this moment, so that it can galvanize everybody's minds around what has to happen now. And I think that we start to see already showing itself. Some people think things are important, others don't think. I mean, I'm happy to, if you look at Home Affairs, for example, there's been some good publicity about things that are happening in Home Affairs. The policy framework hasn't changed.
Nothing.
But the person who's sitting in the chair has decided these are the things. I think it's more important to get like wealthy remote workers in the country. So you don't have to change a law, you don't have to have a major policy overhaul to do that, but it's a decision that's been made. Similarly, in my case, I've identified my 3 priorities, and I've said these are the things that are most important to me. We're going to end hunger, we're going to focus on small-scale farmers, commercialization thereof, we're going to focus on sustainable job creation. And that sets the tone for how we then allocate budget. What programs get fast-tracked and prioritized? What happens in Q1 versus what we throw over to year 3, and so on and so forth. And I think that's really where the incremental change happens. And I'm so sorry, that's just not sexy. I'm sorry that's I know that's not exciting or fun to listen to.
But I think it should be. I think we should also reframe the excitement factor, right? The drama should not just come from people being kicked out of parliament. The drama should, or the interest or the curiosity should not just come from these personal fights,
these-
etc.
Yeah, the big, and it's exactly that. And I think the ability, what's more important, certainly for us in the GNU, is the ability to move beyond influencing and advocating to executing and doing. There were a number of critiques of people saying, why would Rise Mzansi join the GNU with their one seat, or the GPU with the one seat? And I'm like, because the opportunity to sit in a chair and actually make changes, for me, is 10 times more valuable than sitting outside and, I'm not saying protest is not important, but I'm saying in this moment for me, if given an opportunity to actually have the codes and press the button, I want to do that.
Fair enough. Okay, so thank you for that contribution. What I want to do now, because we've got a little bit of time, we're supposed to finish at 1 and want to try to squeeze it in. There are people in the audience that I would, Bakile, can you please come and grab this mic here? We'll use that as a roving mic. So just try to speak into the mic. Any questions that you have for the panel that you would like to ask? If there's anybody who's been feeling, there we go, we'll give it to the gentleman. Please introduce yourself and then ask your question.
Sure. Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me clearly. Sorry.
Yes, so you need to speak up for us to hear you, but the mic will still catch you, yeah.
Sure. So I work with the MEC and Danny Sile here. I'm actually with Rise Mzansi. I know Mbali from, 18 years or something like that. We're becoming very old, aren't we? But in any event, okay, so I want to state clearly I am from Rise Mzansi.
Yes, fair.
But I actually wanted to ask you an Action SA question, just to see the different viewpoints of the people on the panel. So let's see. Herman Mashaba had said that he will not go into coalition with the ANC. He won't work with them. And that's why you don't find Action SA in the GNU. You don't find them in, being a minister, being any kind of committee chairperson. But miraculously, you find them in what they don't term a coalition here in the city of Johannesburg, by the way, because they said that, they have a speaker, they have committee chairs, so they're conducting oversight, which I doubt very much creates any kind of differentiating aspect in your average resident's mind in Joburg. But in Pretoria, although we all love Dr. Nasipi Moya very much, I'm sure, and she's also very well known to us, there they have an actual coalition with the ANC. So you have maybe a bit of a flip-floppery, approach, where I think that, not to put, words in anyone's mind, but I'd love to see what the panelists think. Is it a party that's still going to exist, really? Because supposedly why they want to govern Tshwane is to sell the story of good governance. But you have on the one hand saying, I will never work with these people. Then you go and work with these people. Anyone that I know that did vote for them supported them because of things like what Mashaba initially said. And now people don't really know, I think, what the party stands for anymore. But I'm sure that there's probably mixed, feelings on this.
All right, I think the question is clear. We're going to take another question and then I'm going to close it. Is there any other question? If not, we've noted the Action SA question. I wanted to ask a question around Bella. And the question around Bella is almost twofold. Number one, it seemed like it was a point of contention that could unravel this particular GNU. Are we going to get to a point where we have a minority government when the DA pulls out of this thing? Because Bella was strike one, if you will. NHI seems to have been an issue of contention according to Sunday Times reporting, and 4 journalists reported on this. And then now you've had the issue of Russia. So question one is around, are we getting to a point where if this thing doesn't get resolved in December favorably, the DA pulls out? Number two is more specific to the actual content of the bill. One of the issues that were debated were issues around, school governing body autonomy and Afrikaans, etc. But for me, one of the curious things there was the extension of the definition of corporal punishment. to include even sending a kid to the back of the class, etc. Considering that there are issues with discipline, and that in the classrooms already, and that education is one of the biggest crises from the NDP, any diagnostic that you look at, whether it's World Bank or whatever, mentions education. Is this Bella bill, particularly that provision of the, the expansion of the definition of corporal punishment, going to negatively affect the classroom or not? So that's the one question I thought you guys, you're in various ways involved in education. So I thought, let's also crystallize on thinking about the implementation of these particular things, because now this thing was signed within this 100-day period. And then obviously you got the question about flip-flopping. And if I were to reframe it a little bit, it would be, are voters entitled to push back to Vuyiswa, to push back to Herman and anybody else to say, you told me in no uncertain terms, you're not going to make a deal with these people. And look and behold, there you are telling me it's a compromise, it's the only thing I had to do, I had to kiss the frog, whatever the case may be. How does that strengthen democracy? Mbali was talking earlier about issues of voter apathy, issues of people feeling that politics is just performative and it's only for the elites. Is that not a legitimate thing that ought to be asked as well or reflected upon? So we're out of time, but try as best as you can to answer as quickly as you can. We'll start with you, Mbali, and then we'll go through all of the panelists, and those will be your closing remarks, basically.
Oh, I had a question now.
He's one.
Now you're back on podium. You have to answer. Pick up your mic and reflect.
God, I was so busy.
Mike.
I was so busy actually formulating my question and listening to what you were saying that I didn't actually listen to it as a panelist. So let me leave it to the panel. But I will say just very much in closing, when Vuyiswa was talking, I was missing politics so much, and I was like, oh yes, of course, the QF and the MTV and the budget, but again, the thing that keeps coming back to me is that how many people know what the budget process is? And I'm worried that, and I suppose a little bit of what I was going to ask is, what are we going to do? We can talk about these structural changes needing a long time, which I don't think all of them actually do require it, but what are we going to do? What are the actual practical steps that the panel and all of us must think about? What do we do now? Whether it's, like I said, whoever's in government, but we can't have these conversations every 5 years about the same thing. It doesn't matter about the GNU. What are we practically able to do now, and how are we going to coalesce and have the answer to what the moment is? I don't have any one clear answer, but I really think that we need to spend a real amount of time as South Africans thinking about what's next, quite frankly, and what do we do to push back, and not just waiting for the legislative part of it to give us permission, because how do we push back on people that say that we're going to do one thing and then don't do it? Yeah.
All right. So there was a question at the back. What I'm going to do is, Vuyiswa, we're going to release you because we appreciate your schedule is very hectic. And then we're just going to stay 5 more minutes just to allow you guys to not feel like you're in too much of a rush. But you're all academics. You all know how to speak under time pressure. And I think it's been a very fruitful panel regardless of the time constraint. So is the mic still with you, buddy? Okay. The gentleman wanted to ask a question. Please ask your question quickly, then we will then bring it to the podium.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. My question was actually for Vuyiswa. She can just give us a bit, because you stated that GNU is like not a permanent solution, but like a best case scenario for us as the Republic. I was just kind of like interested, like what that means, maybe like from a Rise Mzansi perspective, but also from just a leadership position as you occupy right now. And I think one last other question was for Sispindile. Just wanted to ask you to please go over the first interpretation. I missed it a bit because I jumped on the call, so I got the last 2. Thank you.
Tea, coffee, tea.
We'll start with you, please.
I love it. Okay. I jumped on the call.
Are you ready or do you need time?
Yeah, no. No, born ready. So the electoral outcomes of the recent election were the push factor towards this arrangement. If we, in the next election, have a different balance, there would be no need for a thing called a GNU, right? I'm just saying, like, let's say Rise Mzansi shoots the lights out, gets 51%. We are not GNUing. We are carrying on with our lives and governing, right? So it's a function of an electoral outcome. And the proof of that is that it doesn't exist in the same form. It doesn't exist, actually, in all 9 provinces. Only those provinces where the electoral outcome necessitates a power-sharing agreement is that, do you see this GNU compromise position? But then, if I even go a step further, 2026 is around the corner. We are going into local elections. And this is where, this is the coalface of governance, as far as I'm concerned. And I think it's going to be a real moment, a testing moment for the GNU, how the different parties who are supposed to be co-governing or are co-governing at a national level manage and navigate that contestation when it gets to local elections. Because typically in an election campaign, we must trash each other. That's the content you guys signed up for.
Yeah.
So how is that going to work? And I think this is a very big question. So the point that was made earlier about these agreements that are still loose in terms of, consensus agreements, et cetera, those things need to be resolved quickly to ensure even the sustainability and long-term viability of the GNU. Because I'm pretty sure that as we get closer to elections, there will be a number of people who make the assessment or the strategic decision that they are better off as a standalone than as part of the whole, so that they are able to obviously be seen to their constituency and grow their bases. And ultimately, you still have all these different independent parties contesting for space and contesting often for similar bases. So that's going to become a factor in 2026. And it will be interesting to me to see if the parties within the GNU, certainly at a national level, are able to apply the necessary political maturity required to navigate that moment. Thus far, there are certain parties that leave much to be desired in terms of that aspect. So it'll be interesting to see how that works out. But yeah, I think it's, as I still maintain, it's the best outcome for what we had, and to the point that was made, we did not have anarchy, we did not have a stalemate of a government that couldn't be formed for months or years. We didn't have an interruption in service delivery. We are still on, we still have the lights on, So there are a lot of good things that have come out of it, but I'm not of the view that it is an eternal state of being, no.
Well, thank you so much, Jimmy. Well, the questions, I'll start with Michael's question on Action SA. I don't think this is only an Action SA problem. I think we've seen across party lines. People come out and say, are we not working with the ANC? Then jiggy, they are voting with the ANC in parliament, right? So it's something that the politicians, they like putting a front that is not true with people, making a stance that they do not even interrogate. So Helen Mashaba, and there was a time when Bongani Baloyi was still the mayor, right? He wanted to work with the ANC. There was discussions within the Action SA, but at some point they didn't do it. And then it was actually played out as if it was his own doing. So Helen Mashaba did something that Action SA had in mind a while ago, but he disagreed with it. Maybe now it is a change of heart, and also they want something also. They want to be part of governance. So hence now they actually voted with the ANC. So it's politicians, they change their minds every day or every hour then. So it's something that happens, and it's not something that is new in South Africa. And maybe we can hold them accountable to that. Like, you said this to your constituency. Why now are you changing your position? What does it mean when you work with the ANC? Are you now blind to the problems that they've created in this country, or now are you going to fix ANC from inside when you're working with them in governance? So it's questions we can ask them, but it's not something that we can actually hang Action SA alone, meanwhile other parties are also doing the same, right? So that's the answer I have for you on that one. On the Bella Bill, I always say Bella Bill. I feel it sounds better when I say it like that. Yes, it's Act now. The Bella one, I do feel like it did not necessarily have adequate participation. And adequate for me matters in the sense that where the public participation dialogues were held, right, and who was participating, who had the loudest voice. And sometimes even, yes, the language which was used was the language that they were hosting in, maybe Xhosa if they're hosting Kwazulu and so on. But also matters some of the terminologies they use in the actual bill when it was still the bill, right? So some people had different interpretations with the corporal punishment that now as a teacher, I can't tell a kid to leave my class if they are misbehaving. You are disempowering me as a teacher. Parents, they do not like the part of you're going to get arrested if your kid is not going to school. They have numerous issues why the kids are not in school. Some don't have birth certificates and so on and so forth. Also the empowering of SGBs. Some communities are saying that SGBs are an integral part of schools. So it's important that they are forming part of the decision making. Some are like, no, SGBs have caused so much problems. So there was not enough dialogue, right, from the public perspective. But again, the DA and the ANC, they're fighting for two different things. Particularly, the DA, I don't understand it, like when they're fighting with the Afrikaans. That language matters, and language matters for the other schools as well. So if it matters for your children, it also matters for the black children, that they have to learn Afrikaans, that they don't speak at home, they have to go to schools, speak English, disregard their own languages, they act to be a different person in the school, and then they come back to a township and they have to be another person. So those things mattered. So the ANC and the DA, they're fighting for different things, and hence I do think that the DA stance in not endorsing the act itself is disingenuous. They are not necessarily fighting for the kids itself. They are fighting for particular kids. They're fighting for a particular class and particular communities. They're not fighting for the entire population of learners in South Africa. Because there are things that I do think that the act is quite progressive on. And we do want to see changes in school, transformation, the language use. Some of us did not do well in school because sometimes the language that was used for us was not necessarily so palatable. So imagine if you learned some things in isiXhosa and so on and so forth, and you learned some things in school instead of learning them on the streets, it was going to be much better. So their contention in the bill, it's based on who they represent as the parties. It's not necessarily on the interests of South Africans. And I do hope that the act actually goes into implementation, even though I have reservations with the public participation, because generally I do think it's progressive, because our education system is it needs to be transformed. This morning, yesterday, Musi Maimane wanted to challenge the 50%, the 30% pass mark. He wants it to be 50%. I'm saying that is a good thing, right? But we need to look at the structural issues that kids face instead of looking at the 50% or 30%. You're going to increase to 50%, and yet you learn them at school. Or you learn.
But one of the questions I'm asking you guys, I don't want you to forget it, is in that structural discussion or progressiveness, are we not creating new unintended consequences? Because the provisions around corporal punishment are very broad. And I'm just worried now from a teacher perspective that we said, okay, you can teach them in Xhosa, but now they can delela you in all the languages, and there's nothing that you can do. And then that then creates a system where later on we are now saying to Musi Maimane, no, but we created this other unintended consequence and this other unintended consequence, so this is why you're not seeing 50%. So I want you to reflect on that, but not necessarily you, because I think you've covered the public participation part quite well. Pindi, do you want to just quickly?
Yes, I want to. Yeah. So also the misconception that when you use the particular languages, it's clause of Venek, there's going to be disorder and
no, I'm just saying that the clause on discipline, because the language clause is one thing. The clause on, because there were 5 clauses. There was a clause which deals around this idea of corporal punishment and discipline, and then basically defines it in such a way that if a kid can claim that you caused them emotional distress, however subjectively they interpreted it, that action by the teacher also is now illegal and is corporal punishment, which is a progressive soft parenting idea. I don't know if it's an idea that can work with 40, 50 kids in a classroom. That's just me trying to place myself in the position of a teacher ekhaya.
Okay. Yeah, no, definitely. And also that clause I find it progressive because there's so many learners or even people who have traumas from high school, like a teacher made a comment, particularly white teachers make a comment which is very subtle, which is very nuanced, which is very polite. Like, oh, please keep quiet, this is not komakaki.
Yeah.
Right? And then for you, if you interpret as emotional distress, progressive is good. They're not going to shout at you. And I do think that even the township schools and rural schools, they know the right things to do. The teachers know very well how to teach learners, then they will navigate this space. Hence, I do think that the bill itself, the act itself is progressive. Those things can be attended to as they come.
So political answer, that last part. Pindi, let's go to you.
Yeah, so maybe there's an idea for another conversation,
panel,
that brings in some of the student organizations, the educationalists, and just dive deep into
Drill deeper.
Yeah, but I think what's important is that obviously you brought that issue up to show us some of the areas of conflict and tension, disagreements, and all of that. I do think that we're going to see more of that, and there's another big test that is coming. And that test really will be around the wage negotiations for the public service, this next round. And it's going to be testing because the parties in coalition also come with their social base into this issue. The ANC comes with labor, organized labor, and their own demands, and even organized labor that is outside of the alliance, the tripartite alliance, has already said that this is the first big test. Actually, all these other issues are small, but the first big test will come around this round of negotiations. They will. I mean, look, my approach to reading this, because I don't like projecting and future. That's not what I do. But what I do is that I look at the social forces behind each party. Now, the next, I don't know how long this GNU is going to last for, but the ANC does stand a big risk of alienating its social base. And it has to negotiate that quite strategically. Because as Thabang said, I mean, both the ANC and the DA believe in market-led development. But the two organizations, parties, have got distinct social, they've got distinct social forces behind them. The ANC still has to, and that's why it's kept to the social programs over time, and redistributive programs over time. It still has to satisfy working class people, black working class people, sections of the middle class as well. It will want to do so even more because we saw in this last election the DA made significant inroads in Sebokeng and other black working class townships. So that's also going to determine how it responds to these questions, or at least should think about those questions. And then maybe the last thing I'll say as I close, because I also think it's important to be forward-looking. And Mbali said we react or we wait. Yesterday we heard, okay, the inaugural meeting of this national dialogue will be in January.
16 December.
16 December. Why am I thinking January? 16 December, yes.
And then Helen complained already saying.
Yes, but I mean, I've been so frustrated because our response is, oh, it's an elite pact, we dismiss it. Oh, they want to tell us what we do. But it's like we're not having the conversation about, okay, how do we then, if it is an elite pact, how do we then grab this thing and make it ours? What do we want? What are our demands? And you asked the question about the staffing in ministerial offices. That's a side issue for me. The big issue is that the education budget, even in this province, I mean, Matume said they're going to cut scholar learner transport. I don't know how
and nutrition programs.
And nutrition programs. That's a big thing. You know, the biggest education system is in KZN, if I'm not mistaken, and 4 billion shortfall in that. You know, Free State, they've got 22%. What's this thing? The vacancy rate for doctors. So, I mean, for me, those are the big issues.
But you see, my thing is like, if you don't have employees, how are you even?
Yeah, but they are in the political. See, I used to work in a political office.
So you're saying they don't matter?
We do work. I used to write nice speeches. We do public participation. We listen and budget votes and. The public service is, Thabang was, we were in the same department, by the way, same time. Thabang was, So I think the staff in the ministerial offices are very important. I think I was important, but I don't think that's the core of what we're facing. You spoke, the analogy you made about the trauma and doctors having, we've got a shortage of hands and feet in hospitals. There have been bed cuts over the years. Those are, I think, the core issues that we need to be tackling. On crime, the policing ratio, I mean, our security, private securities.
So Pindi, what I'm hearing from you is that you are not seeing movement so far on those things.
I
by
don't
December,
see
you
movement
want-
so far in those things. I think the trajectory, what we've seen, will still continue. And I do think that from below, we must put pressure on this government. I don't think that we must fold our arms. I think let's see, how do we use parliament? Also considering that now we've got 10 parties out of 18 who are part of this thing. We also have to be vulnerable and to admit that we don't know everything. So I was encouraged a few weeks ago when someone who's leading in civil society, in the health sector on health equality said, we don't know what to do with this new configuration, because in the past, if we wanted a policy through, if we wanted to win an issue, we'd knock at the ANC, NEC, or we'd identify some allies within the ANC, and we would know that, okay, they will champion, whether it's on, what's this thing, the big or whatnot. But right now, it's not. They don't know what to do.
What is the line of strategy?
But for me, I think there are more alliances now. You know, we can knock on the doors, we can talk to RISE, lobby PAC. Still, don't ignore the EFF. They're still so important if they can figure, this moment out properly. But they're vitally important.
Yes.
So I think some vulnerability. But let's also move. This waiting is not helping. Let's meet. Let's chat. Let's set the agenda.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Dr. Tabang?
Thank you. Okay, I want to touch on a few
You just
things.
fix your mic just to make sure that it's...
Okay, thanks. So I want to touch on a few things. The first one is that I think that our democracy is in an experimental phase. So we've never really been in this kind of position that we find ourselves in. So we are in what I would like to call an experimental phase of our democracy. And no one really knows what this will lead to, right? We have opinions, but no one really knows, right? So that's the first thing, that we're in an experimental one, and we should actually, like, you know, an experiment means that things can go
All manner of directions.
all manner of directions.
But
right?
you have a hypothesis still as the
I do.
practitioner, yeah.
I do, right? And so the one thing that I want to touch on is that okay, so question of transformation, right? I think there has been transformation in the country in the sense that we do have a multiracial elite class that is growing in size that's never been seen in South Africa before.
Yeah.
Okay, and that's a significant transformation. Now, transformation also depends for who, right? If we say that the GNU is a market-friendly coalition, it likely will be in the favor of capital, right? And the question that we then have to ask ourselves is, what do we do to build a more inclusive kind of, democratic dispensation? And back to the class question, if we have a multiracial elite class, it suggests that class is becoming a significant social differentiator in South Africa over race. And I'm not saying that race is not important, but the fact that even the middle class, the nature of inequality that we have is increasingly more intra-class, meaning that the inequality between black people is increasing much faster than the inequality between blacks and whites. So class is becoming key. Now, if class is becoming key, the GNU, on its current trajectory, is likely to benefit a particular class over another. Obviously, the tripartite forces don't think that this is favorable to the working class. The SACP, COSATU, they don't think that is favorable to the working class. Okay? But the middle class, the elite, I think this is a very good coalition for that class, right? In the sense that, it's going to open up new opportunities. The JSE is booming, stocks are reaching new highs. what you call disposable incomes are rising, inflation is stabilizing, there's a rate cut on the cards, the property sector is also responding well. So when you look at it from a class perspective, definitely there will be a transformation. The question is, will it dent inequality? Will we see a dent in inequality? Will we see a dent in poverty? Now, I want to say something that I've been thinking about over the past few days, and it involves the unemployed. Right? I think the unemployed are increasingly becoming agitated, angry, and alienated because the democratic project excludes them. And if it continues to do so, I think there are signs, there's emerging signs that they are starting to think about what to do about their exclusion and what kinds of demands to make. I think the demand for social change will not likely come from the working class, the constituency of Kosatu. I think it's going to come from the unemployed. And they're growing in size. So if you look at the unemployed, 12 million growing. If you look at the working class, it's 16 million declining. So clearly, the balance of I don't want to use the balance of forces, but the social dynamic balances are shifting towards the unemployed who are feeling excluded from the democratic project, but who at the same time beginning in some ways to organize themselves. And one day we will, and I'm not raising alarm bells, we will experience an eruption of sort by the unemployed if the democratic project continues to exclude them. Recently, in the city of Johannesburg, okay, we could say this is just one example, but we've seen a mobilization by unemployed young people, right, going to the city with CVs and making particular demands. And I would say that those particular demands were not just directed at the city. They're directed at the South African democratic project that's excluding the unemployed. So I don't see it as a threat to democracy or social order, this kind of rising of the unemployed. I think it's necessary for a richer and more inclusive democratic project.
Okay, all right. I think those are powerful remarks. We're going to leave it there because we went a little bit over time. Thank you, everybody, for attending. Thank you so much, MEC, for being on the streets with us. And thank you, Mbali, for your presentation and some of your questions, which I think we haven't answered, but are very important food for thought around what do we do, questions around how do we participate in the next stages of the discourse so that it doesn't become an elite chat. And I think those questions will carry over, and hopefully when We Are the People does more of these conversations, we can then flesh out some of these ideas. I think discourse on platforms such as this, where you archive this content, even if it is on YouTube and on the internet, it then becomes a library that people can come to later and say, hey, in October of 2024, this is what we were thinking, and now this is where we need to go because we can't be thinking about this at this later stage. So thank you so much. Refreshments are going to be provided at the back, and if you need your parking validated, please speak to Lebo. She will sort you out. And I think that's the last announcement, right? Otherwise, thanks so much, everybody, for spending time with us. Thank you.
Thanks, Mighti. Thank you.